a whole bunch of stuff, but the economy would be completely insane as a result. The economy does not grow because people buy stuff. The economy grows because there's capital investment in improving efficiency in various things. It's all B2B stuff that causes the economy to grow. The consumer stuff is just an effect of that. So, but it's, of course, what's easier to measure, but it's just nonsense. I mean, this is the whole lie behind stimulus packages, right? Just get consumers to buy stuff or get people to buy stuff, and suddenly that's good for the economy. Well, no. I mean, because every time you buy stuff to consume, you're not investing in improvements. So anyway. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation predicts construction of new homes will fall 11% this year. Bad news for the economy as Canada has come to be, as the US was, more reliant on real estate and construction-related activity than it has been in recorded history. The FIRE industries, finance, insurance, and real estate, amount to 27% of the economy, up from a long-term average of 24%. Construction slowdown could translate into big job losses. House prices in Canada suffered 6 straight months of declines before leveling off in April, according to Terranet, but sales volumes have dropped sharply over the past year, down 15.3% from a year earlier, according to the latest numbers. And the supply of homes available on the market is growing relative to the number of buyers, which is a bad sign for future prices. There's Capital Markets predicts a 25% drop in house prices. The Economist indicates Canada has one of the most overvalued housing markets in the world. And we all know what happens. Look at the US. What happens when housing prices begin to decline? Well, the lie that your house is your ATM is revealed, and the economy just goes through an unbelievable, stomach-churning, retching kind of monkey in a barrel rolling down a hill off a cliff series of events. So, of course, what happens here in the housing price index from 2007 to 2010, you can see this decline, and a massive decline in the net worth of families, to the point where in the US, families now have a lower net worth than they did in 1989. Right? So all of these increases in housing prices, which makes people feel wealthier, which makes people feel... The other thing, too, is like if you believe that your house is continually growing in value, that becomes what you invest in, which is really just setting fire to your money in a slow house-shaped form. And the lie of that, and everything that's not done, opportunity costs are everything when you look at economics. So the fact is that people are investing in their house. They say, oh, I'm going to build a deck. It's like, well, the deck is a consumption good. It's not going to make you money after that. It's like buying a gaming computer rather than a productivity computer. It's fun, but it just doesn't add anything to your wealth in the long run. It consumes and destroys it, which is not to say that's bad. It's just that's the natural economic outcome of it. And so when people think that their houses are continually increasing in value, they don't do other things which they could do that will actually increase in value. And so this is why it's such a calamity when it all falls apart. So let's look at the international view of the Canadian economy. Forget about people who, and this includes me, but forget about people who have opinions about the economy. What you want to do is look at the people who are betting on various economies, because that's usually their own money, or at least money that they're responsible for, and they do a heck of a lot more work than generalized pundits. And global investors are turning against Canada's economy, and they're placing some of the largest bets on record that Canada's housing market, financial sector, and currency are in for a rough ride. A report Monday in the Financial Post indicates that a near record amount of money is being placed against Canada's major banks. In other words, people are shorting. They're going to make money if the bank stocks go down. The length of time it would take for investors who are shorting Canadian banks to cover their debts if the stock went up is now at 10.3 days compared to just 1.3 days for US banks. Right? So you're going to make money if the stock price goes down. If the stock price goes up, you have to pay money in, and the amount of time it will take for them to pay money in is over 10 days. Anything over 5 suggests investors are pessimistic. Follows a report last week, the Canadian dollar has become the second most shorted major global currency after the Japanese yen. I think Japan is, over 250% of debt to GDP ratio, suggesting investors widely expect the Canadian dollar to keep sliding. Several trends appear to be behind the negative sentiment, including a weakening housing market and falling prices for commodities such as oil and gold. Both of these trends could impact the country's economy, given Canada's well-known reliance on commodities and given that housing now supports a greater percentage of Canadian jobs than it has in recent history. Also, of course, when the housing market crashes, all the people who were trained in that housing market have to go retrain, which is a huge drain on the economy. San Francisco-based Hyphen Partners LP is putting 95% of its clients' assets into bets against Canada's housing market and banks. Canada faces 2 risks, says this dude, housing and banks. Very few people are looking at those risks simultaneously. That collectively presents a lot of opportunity for those who wish to make money off the Canadian economy's expected decline. In terms of the market, Canada is a rather exciting place to do business, as I did for about 15 years. Most Canadian small businesses pay much more than their US counterparts to comply with regulatory requirements. Smallest businesses in Canada, fewer than 5 employees, pay 45% more per employee, almost $6,000, to comply with government regs than their US counterparts, $4,000. Total cost of regulation to Canadian businesses is $31 billion a year. In addition, Canadians spend more hours a year to comply with regulations, 171 hours versus 130 hours in the US. Productivity growth in Canada was 0.7% between 2001 and 2011, well below the US with 1.8% and OECD average of 1.4%. The productivity growth, as I said, is everything, but it has to be productivity growth in investment goods, ideally, rather than consumer goods. So housing being a consumer good, something which you use up in value and does not create additional value itself. If you count all of the growth in the housing sector and housing market, then it's probably even low if you discount all of that stuff, which is not going to add to our growth in the long run. 2012, a record 882,000 Canadians used food banks, highest level ever, which is 26% above 2008 levels. Number of Ontario residents on welfare jumped by more than 63,000 last year. Social assistance caseload increased by about 20% between November 2008 and November 2009. British Columbia, also known as the left coast, it's also risen significantly. Slumping economy takes its toll. The latest numbers from the Ministry of Housing and Social Development show the number of people on social assistance who were able and expected to work has increased almost 50% in the last 6 months. And here's some more details. As you can see, the vast majority of the welfare cases are single moms. Single moms, I mean, basically the welfare state is deliver money from single people and people with 2 parents, families, to single moms. This is a huge, giant suck and sound of the need for single moms to have resources. Number of people on welfare rose 26.2%. People defined as unable to work because of persistent multiple barriers fell nearly 4%. So not good as a whole. There's a 21-year difference in life expectancy between the poorest neighbourhood and the wealthiest neighbourhood in Hamilton, Ontario. Again, this is a huge cost to the economy as a whole. For the richest 1%, the share of all Canadian incomes almost doubled between the late 1970s and 2007. For the richest 0.1% of tax filers, their total share almost tripled. And for the creme de la creme, the richest 0.01%, making more than $640,000 a year, their share of the total incomes more than quintupled, right? Because the government in the 1960s began a process of attempting to narrow inequality, right, to narrow the gaps between rich and poor. As a result, since violence always achieves the opposite of what you want, this gap has only increased. Between 1980 and 2005, median earnings among Canada's top earners rose more than 16%, while those in the bottom fifth saw their wages dip by 20%. The report from the OECD said the top 1% of Canadians saw their share of the country's total income increased from 13.3% in 2007 from only 8.1% in 1980. Their share of income, the top 0.1%, saw their share of income more than double to 5.3% from 2%. Top 10% of Canadians in 2008 earned $103,000 on average, 10 times higher than the bottom 10% who made an average of $10,000. This is an 8-to-1. This is up from 8-to-1 in the early 1990s, higher than the overall OECD average. Out of 25 developed countries, Canada ties for last place for failing to attain 9 of UNICEF's 10 benchmark indicators of quality and access to early childhood education and care. Canada is brutal on the environment, Canada is brutal on children, Canada is brutal on the poor, and Canada is particularly brutal on the native population. So let's just take a few minutes to talk about this. And the reason I want to talk about this is to show something very, very important. As government power grows over community, that community tends to do worse unless that community is very rich. But over the poor, as government power grows over the poor communities, those communities tend to do worse. And there's no place in the West where the government has more power of a community than it does over the native population. So let's really recognize that this is where the poor are heading to if the government continues to gain more and more power. If you look at the sort of ghetto in Canada or in the US or even in Europe, government controls the roads, government controls the housing, government controls the education, government controls the sewage, government controls the electricity, government controls almost the entire environment. It's a government zoo that these people are living in, and it really tends to be pretty wretched. I mean, they bulldoze these public sector housing projects all the time because they just become so completely ruined and wrecked. So it's really important, if you want to look at the future of the poor, look at areas where the government has more power over the poor, and this would be the native population. The First Nations is what they're called in Canada. Children are suffering the greatest levels of poverty of all children in the country. One Aboriginal child in 8 is disabled, double the rate of all children in Canada. 43% of First Nations children lack basic dental care. Overcrowding is double the rate of general Canadian families. Mold contaminates almost half of their households. Almost half the Aboriginal children under 15 live with a single parent in urban areas. 100 First Nations communities have to boil their water. Of all off-reserve Aboriginal children, 40% live in poverty. The biggest revenue source for them, of course, is transfers from the federal government, which is really not exactly true. It's transfers from Canadian taxpayers and mostly the unborn in terms of debt. Aboriginal children in Canada die from unintentional injuries at rates 3 or 4 times higher than the national average. While injuries are the leading cause of death for all Canadian children, they affect Aboriginal kids disproportionately. In some areas of Manitoba, Saskatchewan and British Columbia, the injury-related death rate for First Nations children is 6.5 times that of the general population. For certain injuries, it's 22 times higher. Unintentional injuries cause 6% of deaths in Canada, but 26% of all Aboriginal deaths. This is sort of young and old.